You're watching Word Alive Bible Study at Word Tabernacle Church.
I need a word, life-changing word.
A place of relevant ministry where relationships are built, needs are met, purpose is fulfilled, and God is enjoyed. Join us now as we get stronger, grow deeper, and go higher.
Stronger, deeper, and higher every day. We need a word.
Today, as we examine Joshua chapter 2, I want to talk about unconventional leadership. Everybody say unconventional. I want to talk about unconventional leadership as we examine Joshua chapter 2. We're going to kind of take it in 4 segments, I think. And before I read the first few verses, let me just say that Joshua 2 cannot be understood properly independent of the concept of the providence of God. Now, that's not something we talk a lot about, but to make it super simple, the providence of God is simply saying to us that we don't serve a God who created something and then stepped away from it. The providence of God says he's created it and he is actively, in an ongoing way, a part of his creation. Now, I don't want to offend you, but I think we all kind of resemble this comment. It is easy for us to be believers, but to function as atheists. We easily can become functional atheists in the sense that most things we experience, we don't really even give God credit for being a part of. And if I look at Joshua 2, independent of this reality of the providence of God, it leaves me with more questions than answers. And so when we start talking about the issue of the providence of God, we're talking about that whatever God creates, number one, he sustains, not in your notes, but I just want us to understand this concept. So he's created all of this and he's sustaining all of this. But the other issue about the providence of God is about what I call, or what may be referred to as, divine concurrence. Now, that's language you may not know, but it's going to be powerful for you. Divine concurrence simply means while I'm working, God is working. So a great, easy, super example, when you work to sit in the chair, God was working to make sure that the universe was still functioning under the laws he created. So while I work, he works. It's divine concurrence. It doesn't matter if you work to take the breath right now. If God still wasn't working to keep air in the room, then what you did wouldn't matter. So keep that in mind as we talk about Joshua 2, because I only can understand it from the concept of the providence of God. So let's look at it really quickly. Let me read a few of the verses, and we're going to kind of chop it up a little bit today. And so maybe we'll go down from verse 1 maybe to verse 6 or 7. So Joshua chapter 2, verse 1. And Joshua, the son of Nun, sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, go view the land, especially Jericho. Jericho is sort of like, think of it like dominoes, right? They're about to take over the land that God has promised them. The pivotal land is this city-state, if you will, called Jericho. And it's only about 9 miles or so in terms of the acreage, but it's pivotal because it's been built with these double walls. And they've got this prostitute whose house is literally built into the walls. And they know, Joshua recognizes that in order for me to get the land that God has promised, I've got to be pivotal and strategic and take over like the most pivotal territory, which is why he raises up Jericho. Now, there is a faith issue going on here. And this is why I say you got to think about it in terms of the providence of God. Because if we're thinking, really, really thinking, if God says to him in chapter 1, I've already given you the land, then why the first thing you do in chapter 2 is spy it out and not just take it? So there's some tension going on here in terms of how faith is metered out and as it relates to the providence of God. So Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, go view the land, especially Jericho. They came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. And it was told to the king of Jericho, behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land. Now, I want to get to this, but I really have to keep saying this so you get it. There's already too many questions that can't be answered independent of the providence of God. For example, of all the houses they're going to go to, why a prostitute's house? For example, how the king know they were there? So the only way we understand this is providence of God. I'll give you the answer. The reason is that house is because that's the only house in all of Jericho with a believing person in it. They didn't know that. God knew that. Providence of God. So you can only understand this from the perspective of God's providence. So now let me keep reading, and then we're going to get to this handout, I promise you. And it was told the king, verse 2 of Jericho, behold, men of Israel have come. Men of Israel have come. Where'd I go? My paper moved. Behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land. Then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out the land. But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, true, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof and hid them with the stalks of flax that she had laid in order on the roof. So the men pursued after them on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords, and the gate was shut as soon as the pursuers had gone out. Now let's just stop right there for a minute. Let me just get us set up real quick. A couple things by way of introduction on the handout. Here's number 1. And just big stuff right now just to get us started. First thing I want us to see on the handout is the path. That first blank is the word path. The path to the land of promise is not without obstacles and opposition. Really important concept for us to realize, because I think sometimes we want to become successful without opposition and difficulty. And so it's a very deliberate and intentional thing that we're seeing here, that even though, and I want you to get this, God promised in chapter 1. He promises, I've given it to you. He does not promise it's without fight, which is why as believers, we should never theologically and interpretively view Canaan or the promised land as heaven. Because see, they're going to take Jericho, which is in essence the first of the territories that God has given them. But once they take Jericho, there's still fighting that's got to happen. And so the first issue is us understanding that there's going to be a fight, there's going to be a struggle. Here's the second big concept we're going to look at, and that is God's promises of victory do not eliminate times of battle. And so hear my heart and receive this and be encouraged by it. Sometimes the greatest promises require the greatest battles. I think one of the mistakes that we make is we ask God to do removing works and not improving works. So we're oftentimes saying, God, remove this from me, get me out of this, as opposed to saying, well, God is saying, I'm improving you and I'm making you better as a result of you being in it. Here's the last big concept. And I really want to spend a minute, and I hope, let me give you homework when I say this. Our purpose, that blank is the word purpose. Our purpose often includes helping write the biography of someone else. I think this is worth coming to Bible study for right there. It's the book of Joshua, and chapter 2 is about Rahab. Very important concept. In essence, we get the biography, the life transformation of a woman named Rahab. It's literally how a prostitute winds up in paradise. I mean, it's literally how a person we would never think God would use is exactly who he is using to accomplish great work. Let me say this, y'all. If as leaders, all of our effort is about making sure my autobiography is good, and it doesn't include the transformation of someone else's life and their biography, then I am failing in my leadership. So here's the homework. Whose biography have you helped write? Who can say my family is better, my life is better, my community is better because of you being the Joshua? So it's important, it's interesting. Chapter 2, as we launch into the 24 chapter book, already we have evidence of the leadership of Joshua transforming somebody else's life. This is the value, this may be somewhere else on the handout, but this is the value of our yes to God. Because our yes to God could be exactly what someone else needs in their biography to get them to where they need to be. Because you have to understand something. God is pronouncing a total destruction of Jericho. And were it not for the interception of Joshua's leadership, this woman and her whole family could have been wiped out. So as leaders, and not just leaders individually, but leaders in terms of our institutions. Our institutions, use Word Tabernacle as an example. The institution of Word Tabernacle should be helping write the biography of another church. It's not just James Gaillard's purpose helping write the biography of another minister or another individual. I like to say it like this. You know, what person 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now is going to be interviewed on the evening news or the noontime news, and they're going to stick a microphone in their face and they're going to explain how they got to this point? At what point is somebody going to mention you as the reason they got to where they are? Amen. So part of this journey of leadership and success is helping write someone else's biography. Now, there are 4 main aspects of this chapter as it relates to unconventional leadership. Now, I want to kind of introduce them. The first aspect is that unconventional leadership requires unlikely candidates. Unlikely candidates. And it begins right there in verse number 1. Right in verse number 1, I want to spend some time on this because it's so important. Joshua, the son of Nun, sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, "Go view the land, especially Jericho." And they went and came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab and lodged there. Stop right there. Now, 2 things I want us to grab a hold of. As leaders, we have to be open to the fact, and y'all know this, but sometimes we don't act like we know it. We got to be open to the fact that God can use anybody. And if you were honest about you, you should be glad about that statement. I certainly am. And so this is why we don't go back to the providence of God, overarching theological theme of chapter 2. The providence of God says I'm not stuck having to use the most likely people. So when we get bent out of shape and frustrated, why did God use them? Because God's unconventional leadership involves unlikely candidates. Now, there is some faith tension here in verse 1. That's what these blanks are there for. The faith tension in verse 1 is Joshua's first act as commander in chapter 2 is to send out spies. Now, let me stop right here and say this parenthetically. This is the value of leadership, submitting to leadership before you get into leadership. Because this is not the first time spies were sent out to look at some land. He witnessed this dynamic under the leadership of Moses. Problem is they sent him out, only Joshua. Joshua was one of the spies. And Joshua and Caleb are the only 2 that come back with a good report about the land. So where does Joshua get the idea of checking out the land? He gets it from the person he has submitted in leadership under. So this is why leadership is so important, because when we get presented something where we're in charge for the first time, if we've been under leadership, we're going to be able to glean from the people that were in front of us that we've learned from. So notice what happens. Here's the tension. The tension is God has said, I've given you the land. So if God is giving me the land, why am I just spying out the land and not just taking the land? This is what this teaches us, subpoint A, under Roman numeral 2, is we have to use whatever means are at our disposal. Now, this is very important. God has given the land, but that doesn't mean be stupid. And I think this is where, and this is life-changing. If you're sick and you prayed, and God says, I have healed you. Now, he doesn't say that to everybody. That does not mean you stop going to the doctor. Because you use whatever means are at your disposal. So he recognizes that in order for me to be effective, I have to know my enemies. I think too often times we go into battle with the promise of God, but not the knowledge of our enemies. He says, look, in order for me to be successful, I got to study my enemy. I got to know where they're hanging out. What's going on with the territory? What's going on with the wall? What's going on with the land? Because we have to use whatever is at our disposal. Here's the second point of that. And I want to drill on that concept with letter B. As it relates to our prayer life. To pray without using the means that God has given us is almost as foolish as to use the means without praying. I want us to use, everybody say, use the means I've been given. You have to use what's in your hand. You have to use whatever you have. So it's not that I pray or do stuff, I do both. And this is why this is so important. You're going to see the value of this in a minute as we keep reading down the chapter. Let me say one more thing about this, because I want to try to cover as much of this as I can. Praying and sowing belong together. Doing and praying belong together. So just because he knows what God has said does not mean he strictly acts on faith and not on common sense. So this is an important concept for us in terms of pursuing the things that God has called us to do. He begins, first of all, being strategic as a commander, and they wind up sending out spies, and of all the places they can go, providence of God, they wind up in the house of a prostitute. Let me throw this in for free. I think it's book of James and book of Hebrews both reference Rahab. So put a pin in that and think about that before it's all said and done, because every time Rahab's name is mentioned, even after she's been saved, she's always referenced as a prostitute. The reason God does that in the scriptures is to reinforce for us that God can use anybody. And we have to recognize that as a church, y'all, that God can use the most unlikely anybody. Now, here's the second big concept of this unconventional leadership. The unconventional leadership is we get to a point where we have unavoidable choices. And now let's look again, let's pick it back up and let's read it one more time, beginning at verse 2. It was told to the king of Jericho. So there's another question, right? How the king find out? Providence of God. Behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land. Then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, bring out the men who've come to you, who enter your house, for they have come to search out the land. But the woman had taken the 2 men, hidden them. And she said, true, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I do not know where the men went. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof and hid them with the stalks of the flax that she had laid in order on the roof. And so the men pursued after them on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords, and the gate was shut as soon as the pursuers had gone out. This is major for her. She lives in a community of no believers. They worship false gods, and many of them. I'm going to show you in a minute as we keep reading that she has already some kind of way had an understanding of who God is. And because of that, she now has this unavoidable choice. I've got to choose between protecting these people and the God they serve, or I've got to choose to continue to maintain who I am in this community and do what everybody else in the community does. Unavoidable choices. This is so key for us when we start doing the work that God calls us to do. God will get you to a point. This is going to just smile and take this the way you need to take it. God will eventually get us all to the point on an issue that I can no longer stay on the fence. And at some point, I've got to choose a side. And I think too oftentimes as believers, we like to straddle the fence so I can have friends on both sides of the fence. But at some point, as a leader, I get an unavoidable choice, and I got to choose. This is where she is. And let me say a few things about this. The first thing is success and failure both come with prices, but only one is affordable. So this choice that she has to make, y'all, is that she's got a price to pay either way. Either I'm going to pay the price of losing my friends and my standing in the community. I mean, I want y'all to hear this, and this might be later on the handout, I'm not sure now, but I want you to understand something. This choice means I lose my business. This choice means I lose my company. This choice means that my income is gone. Because my income is attached to the folk that live in Jericho. Because I want to park here for a moment. Let me be clear. This is why the Bible specifies. I'm being a little funny, a little tongue-in-cheek. But this is why the Bible specifies that the men went there to lodge. Some of y'all going to catch. I'm waiting for it to catch up. It was the Bible's way of saying they were not their customers. So the only way she can stay in business is to attract people in Jericho. If she now violates them and chooses God's people, she loses everything. And no matter what, she's got to pay a price. But I would argue only one of the price she could really afford to pay. And here's the second big concept about this issue of these unavoidable choices. The issue of these unavoidable choices is that life's most difficult choices often require learning a new way of life. I think this is why salvation is so hard. You know, we've talked about this in the past. You know, Jesus asked a person who's infirm, do you want to be made well? What kind of question is that? Of course I want to be made well. Well, if the only way I know to live is by begging, and I'm made well, now I have to work for the first time. And this is dangerous, y'all. One of the challenges of leadership is helping people abandon an old life to pursue a new life, but it's going to require a heavy lift and a new change for them. Then sometimes why it's hard for us to come to church, because we know stuff I used to do, can't do that stuff anymore. So this decision of her unavoidable choices means I've got to have a new way of living. Here's the other thing about this unavoidable choice. In the end, we're going to be known by our faith and not by our flaws. Thank you, Lord. And I think this is so important, y'all, for all of us to grab a hold of this concept of recognizing, man, that at the end of the day, we should be celebrating each other's faith and not talking about each other's flaws. And that, so what? We all started somewhere. And so we should not spend our time and our energy talking about what's wrong with somebody, but instead embracing the fact that they're trying to get it right. So what? She had a past as a prostitute. All of us have a Rahab in us. And it may not be her sin, but we all have something by which we've got to recover from and get on the other side of. And I want you to see this. I want you to grab this. I love this. Now, I'm going to show it to you in a minute. You just got to trust me till we get there in about 5 minutes. I believe her statement about who God is evidence that she already is saved. It's no way she has that much knowledge about God in a community like Jericho, and she's not already saved. This is what blows my mind about this. She's saved and still telling lies. Now, let me tell you why this matters. I could have enough knowledge of God that is adequate for my salvation, but limited to practical things. In other words, I know enough to be saved, but I don't know enough yet to not still revert to some of my old stuff. Now, let me tell you why this is powerful. The providence of God. Let me tell you why. The providence of God would teach us that she could have told the truth and the men would have still been okay. Because God had already sent them to the house. And God was going to find a way for them to conquer Jericho because he had already promised in chapter 1 that they would have the land. But she doesn't know that. And what I want us to embrace and grab a hold of about this is to recognize that as we grow in faith, we have to have enough faith that I can fully do what God has called me to do and it still work out okay. But I want to encourage you about something else. If I don't, God will find a way. Now, God did not tell her to lie. God did not orchestrate the lie. God did not write the lie. But God knows how to use the lie. And I want to encourage you, that's why some of us are here today, is because we've been saved and in our salvation, we've still gone the wrong way. And God has found a way to still use whatever has happened. Have you ever been in a space where God still showed up even when you were wrong? Even when you didn't quite do it the right way. And the reason this is important, y'all, for us to understand, if a seasoned believer like Abraham, I was looking at the list, if a seasoned believer like Abraham or like Isaac can resort to deception, if a seasoned believer like David can have all the mistakes he's made, then can we please give Rahab a break? And I think it's important that we understand, y'all, people just meet God. They just start getting right with God. And then we want to be so condemning and so judgmental. Give Rahab a break. Even the Davids in the Bible mess up. And so here she is, God saying, you know what? Even since you've been saved, I can use the lie to accomplish a greater purpose. We're going to get to a point of unavoidable choices. Everybody shout, I got to choose sometimes. I got to choose sometimes. I got to choose. And sometimes my choosing means I have to start running with a different crowd. Tough choice. We've made money together. We've been together. We've been intimate together. But this choice means I can't do it anymore. That's real leadership. That's what grants us a level of success and victory. Here's the third big concept. The third big concept begins at verse number 8. In verse number 8, we see that this woman has unwavering confidence. Unwavering confidence. Look at chapter 2 with me. Let's look at this for just a moment. Pick it up at verse number 8 now. This is the next big section. Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof, said to the men, now this is why I believe she's saved, and I don't think any commentators would argue me on this point. I said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all inhabitants of the land melt away before you. Look at this. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, she knows he's a personal God. Look at it. The Lord your God, the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that as I have dealt kindly with you, you will also deal kindly with me, with my father's house, and give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. And the men said to her, our life for yours, even to death. If you do not tell this business of ours, then when the Lord gives us the land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. Then she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was built into the city wall, that she lived in the wall. And she said to them, go into the hills, or the pursuers will encounter you, and hide there 3 days until the pursuers have returned. Then afterwards you may go your way. Now, this is, first of all, if you go back to chapter 1, God says to Joshua, in 3 days. She has the same information. She makes all of these statements about who God is. And because of this, this woman has unwavering confidence in God. Let me say a few things about this unwavering confidence. The first thing I want you to see about this unwavering confidence is letter A. It requires the help of a reliable testimony. Did you see all the time she kept saying, we heard, we heard, we heard? It's because of the testimony that they had about what God had done that she wound up with unwavering confidence in what God could do. I want to park here for a moment. Jot this down on your margin or somewhere, because I want you to see something here. Let me help you understand something. Faith is only as good as its object. Right? We talk about that over and over again. Faith is only as good as the object of your faith. And so too many of us have faith in faith. Just because I believe it's going to be okay. That ain't nothing. You need faith in God. Right? Not faith in faith. And when we have faith, let me tell you what it looks like. Faith is, and put this in your margins, faith is a whole personality activity. Faith is a whole personality activity. I'm going to give you an example of this in Hebrews in a second. My mind is instructed. That's the first part of my personality. It's not on your notes anywhere. Faith is a whole personality activity. My mind is instructed. But after my mind is instructed, my emotions get stirred. So her mind gets instructed, then her emotions get stirred. And then the third part of it is my will acts in obedience. Now, let me give you an example. This is really powerful, and I want us to understand this, and I don't want to rush this. Whole personality activity. My mind gets instructed, my emotions get stirred, and then my will acts in obedience. That's how I know if I really have faith. This is what we see symbolically and experientially in Rahab. She hears the testimony. Her mind gets alerted, like, wow, God is everything. She suddenly, like, her emotions are like, this thing is real. And the evidence of it is when she has to make a choice, her will acts in obedience and protects the men of God. Keep your ribbon real quick in Joshua, real fast. Look at with me in Hebrews. Let me give you one example. And if you don't even have time to turn in, I'm going to read it to you real quick. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7. I want to give you an example because I want you to see this. This is active in our own lives every day in terms of how we work and in terms of how we operate in faith. Hebrews chapter 11, verse number 7. By faith, everybody say by faith. By faith, Noah being warned by God. Stop right there. Whole personality activity. He was warned by God. That means his intellect, his mind was instructed. He was warned by God. Here's the second step. Look at it. Being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen in reverent fear. His emotions got stirred in fear. And then it says constructed an ark. His will acted in obedience. Do y'all see that? Yo, this is what faith looks like. It's a whole personality activity. And so this is how you know you have faith. That's why you can't claim faith without works. We learned that in the book of James, because faith is a whole personality activity. Now, go back real quick to this last point of unwavering confidence. It's the help of a reliable testimony. But number 2, or letter B, never underestimate the reach of your story. Wow. You don't know who hears your story. This is why, as believers, it's so important that we shut down the negative narratives. And our stories ought to be testimonies about what God has done in our lives. Because we never know what Rahab is listening. Y'all didn't catch it. She's never been to church. Her community doesn't have any saved people. But she heard about what God had done. And that thing started changing her. She was thinking, man, if he could do all that for them, then maybe my situation could look different. So we should never underestimate how far reaching our stories go. But here's the other thing, letter C. Our choices and our leadership have eternal consequences for entire families. If you notice, it's because of what God has done in their life that there's now hope for this whole family. And we have to recognize that when we're in the midst, we should have the kind of confidence that God can literally change people's whole families. We probably don't think of it like this, but entire families could be dependent on your story. Not on how good I taught or how good the music was. Whole communities could be impacted by your story. We see evidence of it here. Now here's the other thing. I'm going to move quick because I want to finish the sheet. The best leaders, everybody say the best leaders. The best leaders have a deep, devoted, and demonstrated love for souls. I'm going to say this. I hope you'll receive it in the love that I'm saying it with. The number one reason not to have a negative testimony is because souls are on the line. Whatever I'm feeling about, if I'm truly a leader, I have so much of a deep, dedicated, devoted desire for souls that I would not dare let my testimony be negative, because I care about people coming to Jesus. And so it is irresponsible of us to use our testimony in a negative way, because we should care about souls. Here's the last point real quick, and then I want to give you this paragraph that's going to change somebody's life. We see evidence of an unfailing Christ. We see evidence of an unfailing Christ. Verse number 17 all the way through verse number 21, we see evidence of let's pick it up at verse number 17 real fast. And the men said to her, we will be guiltless with respect to this oath of yours that you have made us swear. Behold, when we come into the land, you shall tie this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and you shall gather into your house your father and mother and your brothers and all your father's household. That if anyone goes out of the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be his own head, and we shall be guiltless. But if a hand is laid on anyone who is with you in the house, his blood shall be on our head. But if you tell us this business of ours, then we shall be guiltless with respect to your oath, and that you have made us swear. And she said, according to your words, so be it. And then she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window. It's evidence of what we see evidence of this in the Old Testament earlier on, about how when the blood was put over the doorpost, the people were saved. This is evidence of Christ coming, right? So let me say a few things very quickly. Letter A, in Christ, now don't scream too loud when I say this, our past can taint our reputation, but not our destination. In Christ. So notice, because of Christ, her reputation is still a harlot, a prostitute, but it changes her destination. She winds up her whole family being saved and secure. Letter B, obedience to what God commands is the only credible confirmation of belief in what he provides. I've kind of taught that already. Just understanding the real evidence that real faith is a whole personality activity, and the only evidence that I really have faith is obedience. Letter C, continuing obedience is a requirement for success. I don't have time to teach this because I'm out of time, but let me say this. Give me one extra minute. Notice this. Notice the condition that they put on her. They said, now this is good, long as you don't tell our business. So many of us start in obedience, but we don't continue in obedience. So starting in obedience and not continuing in obedience is a formula for failure. And then here's the last thing. Put the whole paragraph up at the same time so they can just see all of it and write these words down real quick. And I'll teach it. I'll start next week teaching it. When a predetermined obedience intersects with a poor beginning, which introduces a possible hope and motivates a personal resolve, the result is a powerful transformation. I'll take 30 seconds to explain it. Here it is. The predetermined obedience is Joshua doing exactly what God called him to do. It intersects with a poor beginning, which is why the men got sent to Rahab's house. So he decided up front to be obedient. God caused them to be introduced to a person with a poor beginning, which was a prostitute. Because they got introduced to this person with a poor beginning, it introduced a possible hope for her. She decided to have now personal resolve, I'm going to do something. And it all resulted in her whole life getting changed. That paragraph, if lived out, could change every person's life in Eastern North Carolina. Because that same formula holds true today as we teach Bible study. Say amen if you can.
Thanks for listening to Orthos. Hope you enjoyed today's Bible study. If you've got questions or comments or feedback, I'd love for you to share it with me. You can email me at james@jamesgaillard.com. I'd also encourage you to follow me on one of my social media outlets. Go ahead and subscribe, either at Facebook or YouTube or Twitter or Instagram. Again, thanks for listening. See you next week.